In this lesson, we're going to learn how to further control our HDRI lighting and also add some custom reflections to our scene. Now, one of the downsides of HDRI in the way that we've set it up in the previous lesson, in other words, including so much light from the HDRI that you basically don't need a sun anymore. Once you do that, the limitation is that if you want to change the position of your sun while keeping your environment the same, you're pretty much fixed to where the sun is coming from in that image. You would otherwise have to go to the HDRI and somehow manipulate the location of the intensity of the sun. Now, you do have the option to create a horizontal rotation. In other words, once you have your HDRI, let's say that mine multiplies 3 so we can see it a bit more, we have the option of rotating it around in this direction. But you can imagine that if you had to create an animation, your sky doesn't rotate. It's only the sun that moves through the sky, so that isn't too realistic. Hence, what I like to use as a combination is to always have the HDRI lighting as the secondary light source and to focus the primary light coming from the sun, and this is something that can be easily animated and moved around. So that just somehow offers much more control in my mind, and it seems to be a much more realistic way of working. What's quite important though is that you know where your HDRI lighting is coming from and what it's doing to your scene. Often that can become very confusing. So one of the tips that I recommend to get around that is to simply create a plane and then a sphere within that plane. And you can texture both of those in a ordinary texture like the one we had for our HDRI, our override material before we started testing the HDRI. And if you just look at that without any cameras in place, you can render out your scene and you can basically see from the render what exactly is happening. So here we can see that the main source of lighting is here, and we can pretty much understand what type of shadows are being cast by this HDRI light. So this is a good way of testing it, and remember that you then can bring up your material editor and start changing the horizontal rotation. So if we go and type 30 degrees, we re-render, then we will see that the light direction all of a sudden is from this side, and this is a good way to go and understand what the HDRI is doing. So why I said that is that it's quite important if you are using a combination of sun and HDRI that the two are making sense together. They're working in harmony. In other words, the direction of your sun should be equal to where the direction of the main source of lighting is coming from in your HDRI file. That's why it's a good idea to know where that light is working from. So for now, I'm going to go and turn on the sun. And now we're pretty much back to our scene the way we started. I'm not using the dome since it's not really part of my workflow, but I know that it is recommended by the providers of the HDRIs themselves. What we're going to look at in this next part of the lesson is how to create a custom reflection. What I mean by this is that if I was working on an empty site and modeling this house that was to be visualized, I would definitely want to take a panoramic photo of this view, and I would want the photos, or at least the renders of this house, to reflect that actual view. Now, you may not have the actual view, of course, in your HDRI library, so you want to bring in a custom reflection. So I generally do this when we're in a cityscape or anything like that where we have particular buildings that we need to reflect, or especially views like this that may be quite customized. So what I like to do in these cases is just a simple arc, and that arc can be drawn at any shape or any scale. You can pretty much have quite a lot of freedom with how you create this shape, as long as it is quite large and as long as it covers the full reflection periphery of what you can see from your camera. So this arc can then be extruded upwards. It's going to be quite a large element, something like so, and we can now convert that to an editable poly. You can select all those polys. They need to be flipped in this case, and we can now go and attach a texture onto it. I'm going to flip now into Photoshop, as there is a texture that we can start working on, which is this one here. Now, this is a file that I pulled off the internet, and we can now do a little bit of work on it before we actually apply it to that arc. Now, let's just say that this was the actual view from the site, and that's pretty much what we want to see in our reflections. So what I'm going to do with you is just include some of the workflow in Photoshop itself, since I almost always touch up all of the textures before actually going and using them in 3D Max. So in this case, what I want to do first of all is I want to increase the canvas size. So I'm just going to double click on my layer so that it's not locked anymore. And I'm going to type in Control-Alt-C. You can also go and access that from the image drop down. And I just want to increase some of the height. So let's say 500 pixels. And we don't actually need that much. We just need roughly this. All I wanted to do here mainly is just get extra area for the sky so that we can have a lot of sky above. Then what I'm going to do is add a gradient, so make a new layer, and I'm going to choose to make a gradient with 2 colors, and both of them, just as a departure point, are going to be the color of the actual sky behind. And then the first sky I'm just going to make slightly darker. I'm going to then apply that gradient to the sky and then just gently brush out the bottom edge with a eraser. I basically just want to extend the sky. If you really want to be cheap and nasty about it, you could also just grab this part of the sky if it didn't have too many clouds, and you could just pull it up as well. There's nothing really wrong, because once you see this in your reflection, you won't really notice the distortion too much unless there are particular buildings or other such things in your scene. So I'm just doing it this way since it is slightly cleaner. And once you get the hue saturation or the color tone, I'm just using Control U for hue saturation and Control L for levels, and these are the 2 main ones that I use just to increase and decrease the brightness, saturation, and all of those parameters. So the other thing I want to do is just decrease some of the saturation of the entire image. So right now it's a little bit too turquoise for my liking, and I want to just make this a little bit brighter on top. So let's go and right click and flatten that, and I'm going to just use the dodge tool, and I'm going to dodge some of the mid tones. To get the brush settings, all I do is I right click on my mouse, and that gives me this little dialog box where I can increase and decrease these settings. So I'm just going to brighten this ever so slightly, and I'm going to just add a little bit more contrast using levels. Now I'm going to use the healing brush tool, and I'm going to use replace, and I'm just going to try and brush out some of the area here which I don't want to see. So to create the actual reference, you just press Alt, click on your screen, and then when you brush, you will basically be brushing where that reference has been taken from. So you do that for a couple of seconds, and once you're ready, save your file. And I'm going to pause the video, and we're just going to now open this texture in 3D Max. So now we're back in Max, and we can create a V-Ray material, and we can apply that texture that we have just created to our object. So let's go now to our project files in our textures, and we scroll down, and those 2 textures are here. The original one was C Panoramic 1, and the one that we're going to use is 1B. And then you can just leave everything as it is, apply it to your model, choose to show the material, and let's just add a UV map to this. So UV enter. Before I added the spherify, which is not what I wanted. And now let's just have ordinary plane mapping. I'm not too worried about the mapping. I'm not going to unwrap it or anything like that. I'm just looking for a pure and rough, crude image that I apply to the background. All I want to do now is I want to get the height of the horizon to be more or less where it would be, so I don't want it too high, otherwise it won't be correct. And now I can go back into my view. I'm going to pause the video and come back to the rendered image. So here we have the result. That image is in place, and we can start to see how it's affecting the front facade where all of this glass is. We can see here that the horizon is more or less in this area where we see this dark line, and some of the clouds are showing through. So of course, the more contrast or the more color you have in that image, the more it's going to reflect on your building. But as well, remember that once you have trees and plants and lighting inside, this won't be visible as much as it is now, because we have this huge facade of glass that is busy being reflected into. So remember that it's not always going to be as prominent as this. But the main thing that I wanted to show you in this lesson is how you can have a single object that has a real reflection or a real view of what you would actually see from the site. So if you, for example, had to put yourself in this position, you would actually want to get that view to be correct. So this is just a way that you can create that realistic environment. One more setting that I wanted to show you before finishing the lesson is what you need to do in the object properties of this large arc. You need to turn off receive and cast shadows. What will happen if you don't do that is that any light sources behind it are going to actually be, this will be basically casting a shadow onto your entire model if you have lights that are behind. So you just want to make sure that receive and casting shadows are both off. You can similarly turn receive and cast shadows for any objects that are right at the bottom or any floors. Anything that doesn't need to cast a shadow because there's nothing underneath it, you can turn the shadow casting off. So that pretty much brings us to the end of this lesson. What we've done is we've looked at a way to change the direction of an HDRI, in other words, looking at that little sphere with a plane. So looking at the direction, we've looked at ways that we can create a custom reflecting object in our background so that we can have very particular reflections that are very controllable when we have large expanses of glass and reflective objects. So the next lesson will be more in the rendering and especially the material setup. That's the next stage. So hang around for that. We're going to basically look at how the materials are changed in Photoshop. We're going to go in and out of Max, between Max and Photoshop in this next stage, where we take materials, we Photoshop them a little bit, we add them to the model, and we basically develop the entire textured model from this point onwards. So I hope that is quite exciting for you too.